I spent 30 years looking through a lens. Every morning I walked into a laboratory that smelled like reagents and cold air, sat down in front of a microscope, and looked at the beginning of life. I taught embryology at one of the most respected universities in the country. I wrote papers, I trained students, I knew every stage of human development by heart, the exact day, the exact shape, the exact cellular mechanism. I knew what a human being looked like at 12 days, at 24, at 40, and I believed in none of it beyond what I could measure. God, to me, was something people invented because they were afraid of silence. I wasn't afraid of silence. I lived in it. The silence of the laboratory, the silence of data, the silence of a world that made perfect sense without needing anything supernatural to explain it. That was my life, until a rainy Tuesday changed everything. It started with my graduate students. They came to my office with a research project, a comparison between ancient texts and modern science. Nothing unusual. Students come to me with unusual requests all the time. But what they handed me that afternoon was different. They placed a few lines of translated text on my desk. No source, no context, just words. And they asked me, Dr. Sarah, at what stage of embryonic development would you describe the human being using these terms? I looked at the first word, Alaqah. They gave me the translation, a leech-like substance, something that clings. I paused. I didn't pause because I didn't know the answer. I paused because I knew it immediately, and the knowing of it unsettled me in a way I didn't expect. The embryo at 24 days. I had seen it hundreds of times, in photographs, in slides, in scanning microscope images. At that stage, it curves, it darkens, it attaches itself to the wall of the uterus and draws blood from the mother's system. And its shape, I had always noted this in a purely academic way, its shape is almost identical to a leech. The same curve, the same clinging posture, the same relationship between a small organism and its host. I wrote my answer carefully on a notepad. This description matches the embryo at approximately 24 days of development, when it is leech-like in appearance and clings to the uterine wall. I looked up. What's the second word? Mudghah, a chewed-like substance. I sat very still when I read that. 30 years of anatomy, and the image came immediately. The somite stage, around 4 to 5 weeks. The somites, parallel ridges running along the back of the embryo, irregular, segmented, like the marks left behind when someone presses their teeth into a piece of soft clay and pulls away. I had seen those photographs 1,000 times. I had shown them to students 1,000 times. I had never once thought of the word chewed. And yet, that was exactly what it looked like. Exactly. I stood up. I pulled a heavy embryology atlas from the shelf behind me and turned to the relevant page without having to search for it. I stared at the image for a long time. Then I wrote, this description corresponds to the embryo at the somite stage, approximately 28 to 30 days, when the irregular segmentation gives the embryo the appearance of having been chewed. Next, I said. My voice had changed. I could hear it myself, still controlled, still precise, but underneath it, something had shifted, the way ice shifts before it breaks. They slid 2 more slips of paper across the desk. Izam, bones. Lam, flesh covering the bones. I did not speak. I teach this sequence every single year. The skeletal system forms first. Bone cells differentiate, construct the frame. Then the muscles develop and wrap themselves around that frame. Flesh, clothing bone. It is one of the foundational sequences of human embryology. It took scientists centuries to discover it. It requires modern imaging technology to observe it. No one in the ancient world could have known it. No one without a microscope, without cellular biology, without tools that did not exist until the 20th century, could have described it. And yet, here it was, written down, in order, without error. My hands were completely still on the desk. I looked at my students. I looked at the slips of paper. And I asked the only question that mattered. Where is this text from? One of them answered quietly, the Quran, written in the 7th century. I asked them to leave. I sat alone in my office for a long time. The sounds of the corridor faded. The fluorescent lights hummed. The smell of paper and reagents, the smell of my entire adult life, surrounded me. And I sat there with the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me in a way that nothing in 30 years of scientific work had ever pressed. The 7th century. I knew exactly what people in the 7th century understood about embryology. I taught it in my history of medicine lectures. They inherited their knowledge almost entirely from the ancient Greeks. Aristotle believed the male sperm contained a tiny, fully formed human being that simply grew inside the womb. The idea of developmental stages, of differentiated cells, of bones forming before muscles, of a leech-like clinging phase, of a chewed lump appearance, none of this was even imaginable without microscopy, without modern biology, without tools that would not exist for another 1,000 years. And yet the text had described it, in sequence, in the correct order, with language that matched what I see under a microscope. I opened my laptop. I worked through the night. I found the name Keith Moore, a Canadian embryologist, one of the most respected in his field, whose textbook is used in medical schools around the world. I found his statements. I read every word. His analysis of the Quranic embryological descriptions was not the work of a man trying to find faith. It was the work of a scientist doing what scientists do, looking at a claim and measuring it against the evidence. His conclusion was clear. The descriptions were accurate. The sequence was correct. The terminology, when examined against modern developmental anatomy, was not vague. It was not coincidental. It was not the product of lucky guesswork. It was precise. And he had included references to the Quranic verses in a later edition of his own textbook, alongside the scientific diagrams. A man of his standing, his credentials, his career built entirely on observable, verifiable science. I sat back in my chair. My rational mind offered its defenses. Coincidence, vague language open to interpretation, selective reading by people who already believed and wanted to find confirmation, motivated reasoning. But I had been handed those words without their source. I had not been guided. I had not been persuaded. I had read them cold as a scientist and matched them myself, independently, and arrived at the same conclusions. I know what scientists are supposed to do when the data contradicts the hypothesis. We revise the hypothesis. In the weeks that followed, I moved the way I always move, through difficult research, carefully, without rushing. I read everything I could find. I questioned everything I read. I followed every thread wherever it led. There was a woman I had never really spoken to at the university, a colleague named Amira. She wore a headscarf and always greeted me in the hallway with a warmth that I, in all the years before, had found pleasant but slightly puzzling. I understood now that it wasn't puzzling at all. I approached her one afternoon and asked if we could talk. We sat in the faculty lounge, 2 cups of tea. I asked her real questions, not the sharp, skeptical challenges I would have used before, like instruments designed to disprove. I asked because I genuinely did not know, and she answered with a patience and a calm that I will never forget. The calm of someone who carries something settled inside them, someone who has found peace and has no desire to force it on anyone else. At one point I said to her, "But how do I know? How does anyone know?" She wrapped both hands around her cup and smiled. "You're already asking the right question," she said. "That's exactly where it begins." 3 months after that rainy Tuesday, I woke up before dawn. I sat on the floor of my apartment, books around me, papers around me, notes I had written to myself at 2 and 3 in the morning, questions I had chased through the night until they resolved themselves into something quieter and more certain than any conclusion I had ever reached in a laboratory. I looked at my hands. These hands had spent 30 years in the most intimate relationship possible with the beginning of human life.
They had held slides and drawn diagrams and pointed to photographs and said with complete authority, "This is what a human being looks like at 24 days." These hands knew better than almost anyone on earth what an extraordinary, precise, staggering miracle of engineering the human body is. I had spent my entire career in awe of the design. I had simply never, until that moment, asked who designed it. In the stillness of that morning, before the city woke, before the university corridors filled with noise and the laboratory lit up with its cold fluorescent hum, I bowed my head for the first time in my life. And the words that came out of me did not feel like a surrender. They felt like an arrival, like a woman who had been walking for 30 years without realizing she had been walking toward something all along, toward the answer that had been waiting for her at the bottom of every slide, in every cellular division, in every photograph of a leech-shaped embryo clinging to life in the dark. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. I bear witness that there is no God but God, and I bear witness that Muhammad is his messenger. I had spent 30 years studying the first moments of human life, and I had finally at last found its source.